Hello and welcome to the SEO Unplugged podcast. I'm your host, Itamar Blauer, and today I'm joined with Mordy Oberstein, who is the head of SEO Branding at Wix. Mordy, how are you doing today?
Yo, what's up? Thank you for having me.
All right, pleasure. And this episode is really interesting because it covers something that Google has announced. I believe it was in May of 2021, and that's MUM. And this is something that has plenty of implications, I think, in terms of the future of SEO, but also how SEOs can approach their strategies and also content. So, Mordy, do you mind kind of giving an introduction into MUM and what it is?
Yeah, so MUM's a new machine learning property that Google's going to. It's open. It's not doesn't belong to Google. Like Bing uses MUM, but Google's going to be adopting it into the algorithm. It has adopted it in certain places or certain instances. There's multiple things that it does, which is good because MUM is multimodal. So, for example, one of the things that it does differently than your typical machine learning property is that usually when you're dealing with machine learning, the input is singular, the output is singular, meaning if you're dealing with images is the input, the output is going to be around images. But with MUM, you can combine multiple media formats. So for example, what Google's already done is it's taken things like, imagine you don't know what an item is, you're trying to fix it. So the case that Google gave was, you're trying to fix a part in your bicycle and you don't know what that piece in the bicycle is called, but you need to fix it. So you can take a picture of it with Lens and ask as part of the app, how to fix, and Google will match up your text input of how to fix, determine what you're taking a look at through Lens, and then show you results on how to fix the chain gear on your bike. Now, you didn't know it was called a chain gear, but Google figured it out for you, and it combined the text, and it combined the images, and hey, it's wonderful. So that's one part of it. The other part is that MUM works across languages, and this is where Google has already used it, and there's further implications to this, but Google kind of uses to say, hey, people are calling the COVID vaccines by, I don't know, nicknames in other languages. So it's not like, you transliterate it into, let's say you're in Japanese or you're in Hebrew or you're in Chinese, whatever it is. It's not a transliterated sound for the Pfizer vaccine. It's like another thing altogether. And there's multiple vaccines and all these nicknames around the world. And Google used MUM to figure out, okay, when in this language they call this vaccine this, they're really referring to the Pfizer vaccine. But I think the implication of that is that if you're in a market, I mean, it could apply to English as well, but I think it's more applicable into markets where there's a real shortage of content. Not that there's not a shortage of content in English, at least good content. And Google said, hey, okay, you asked for this query, you search for something. We don't have a lot of good results, but you know what? There is something in English or there is something in another language that we could translate for you and then show you that. I think that's where this ability to work across multiple languages could come into effect. And then, of course, it's 1,000 times more powerful than BERT, whatever that means. But it's really good at understanding context and understanding implied intent and that sort of thing. So the case that Google gave was, I'm trying to remember the exact query that they gave. It was, I hiked Mount Adams. Now I want to hike Mount, Fuji in the autumn. What do I need to do differently? And it parses that query. So it knows Mount Adams was Mount Fuji. It's in autumn, and you want to do something differently. And it knows you need to do something to prepare. Now, the cool part is that it's also able to take the word prepare and parse that. So in Google's example, it was, okay, it's like, what do you mean prepare? Does that mean you need to know, like, training techniques that are different from Mount Adams for this hike they want to do now? Does that mean equipment that you might need to prepare? What does it mean to prepare? And here's a bunch of, pathways that we can show you around what it means to prepare. So that's MUM like 1 foot, at least in terms of like Google and SEO.
I see. Okay, so it sounds like it's quite complex because it's covering a few different areas in terms of language, in terms of how it understands context. And this is something where if we bring it in to an SEO strategy, where nowadays we're seeing a lot of importance being placed on stuff like search intent, and when we think of stuff like content clusters. So how does MUM sort of match with that more, let's call it a traditional understanding of search intent and content clusters, but how does it, is it exactly the same? Does it take it one step further that SEO should actually start thinking about this sort of stuff in a different light? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, you see this, one of the features that they announced at Google I/O last year was, I think it's like things to know or things to consider. I forgot exactly how they broke what they called it. So it's, imagine you're searching for like, paints or watercolors, whatever it is. they'll show you a breakdown of topics that you need to know about this, or subtopics you need to know about whatever it is you're searching for. So it's really breaking things down. Now, that part of MUM is not really live yet. Like the things that are live, what I mentioned before about understanding, the COVID vaccine across languages and nicknames, some things around Google and images is live. But the crux of MUM is not yet live. It's going to be at some point. Google showed you when they announced it. Here's what we're going to do with this thing. So we're talking about, just want to make sure that's clear. I'm talking about what's coming down the pike, not what exists right now. However, leaving that aside for a second, it means something very, very different about content in general. The classic case that I'll give is you take a simple query, go to Yankees game. I'm a big Yankees fan. So it's very, very simple, right? And the way Google deals with it now is very, very simple and straightforward, right? You mean go to Yankees game. It's play. You need websites where you can buy tickets to go to the Yankees game. Here's a whole bunch of websites that do the same thing. However, when you really consider what the words go to mean, there's a ton of implied intent in there, right? Does that mean how do I get there? What are the traffic conditions? What's the best way to, what about COVID? Do I need a vaccine? Does the guy next to me need a vaccine? Could I bring my own food if I don't want to pay $20 million for a hot dog? Is the neighborhood safe at night? If I wear the other team's colors, as you Brits might call it, or the other team's jersey, will I get my ass kicked? All those sort of things are really important. The answer is yes. If you wear a Red Sox jersey to a Yankees game in the bleachers, not a good idea for your health and well-being. But those are things you need to know, especially now during COVID. There's a whole lot of context around go-to that doesn't really show up on the SERP. I think I remember looking at this a couple of weeks ago. I don't know anymore. And you get one result that kind of walks you through the COVID procedures and going to a baseball game. And that's it. However, if Google's going to introduce MUM into the algorithm and is going to be able to break down go-to in all of the ways and a million times more, I mean, it's endless. Imagine you're a tourist. The context that I just told you completely changes. And Google's able to break all of that down. First off, it's a very different experience on the SERP because Google is going to show you multiple pathways. They're going to have to redesign it some way unless they just go through, what Dan Short calls Google as a microsite, where if you search for something around COVID, let's say, or we search for an entity, you got those little bubble filters at the top. It'll have to do something around that. Imagine in this case, a go to Yankees game, you'll have something for, travel or health information or concessions or, vicinity. Well, however they're going to break it down. The SERP will look a little bit different. But the most important thing is that the content on your site is going to have to align differently, especially in the era of machine learning. I don't think people realize this enough. How does Google know good content versus bad content? They profile that the advent of machine learning on the language basis means that Google's able to profile. And you saw this you originally saw this with the Meta update back in 2018, where Google was looking at sites and saying, hey, you know what? You have a ton of, ads or all of your pages, your informational pages on your health website, all of the internal links go to your product pages. There's nothing going to the CDC or WHO. It's kind of weird. So Google's profiling, you might be a health information site, but your profile is really kind of commerce. So we don't trust you because the information that you're putting there, is that really for the sake of the user? Or is that really so they click on the internal links or all of your CTAs and buy your product from you? But that's the way Google understands things with machine learning, is it profiles things. So John Mueller's talked about this. I think I'm trying to remember the case. I think it was around a health query. And he was asked, how does Google know what's good or not? He's like, well, we're able to look and see, for this topic, how is it talked about on the web? In other words, let's say you're looking at, keywords heart attack prevention. Google's looking at the CDC, the NHS, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, WebMD, all, Johns Hopkins, Harvard Health, and seeing how they talk about this. And then it's taking a look at your content and saying, well, this doesn't match. The profile doesn't align. If Google's going to be taking a different kind of look at content and what it means to be an authority on content, what it means to be comprehensive on content, what it means to be authoritative, what it means to be a quality content, is going to change based on how they're profiling. Meaning, if Google's introducing MUM into the ecosystem, then the profile they're looking for also changes, because now they're looking at content saying, or a topic rather, and saying, this is what we expect. if we're going to comprehensively cover this, we're going to show X, Y, and Z on the SERP. That's what it means to comprehensively cover going to a Yankees game. Now they're going to go to your website and say, okay, do you also comprehensively cover this the same way? Great, you do. Wonderful. You're an authority on this topic. No, you don't. Okay, well, clearly you're lacking a little bit as a set. Now, in terms of, you mentioned content clusters, which is a good point to bring up. And I swear I'll stop running my mouth in a second. I don't like content clusters. Well, I don't like the way that we think about content clusters. What we generally do is we go to an SEO tool like SEMrush, and we type in a term, and we get back a whole bunch of questions. And all right, let's answer all these questions around this topic. See how I'm comprehensive? But that's not targeted. That's not focused. That's not really showing you understand what the heck you're actually. Forget Google for a second. If you are a person, was that how you would approach showing you're an authority on a topic? But it's like smattering a bunch of questions on your website? Or would you consider like who you're targeting, what they need to know, what kind of audience you're speaking to? Like a classic example of this is if you're a review site and you have tons of content about a particular topic or product on your site, but none of it has to do with reviews. Are you an authority now because you have a ton of content and answer a bunch of questions on your site? Even though that kind of content, while topically it makes sense, the format has nothing to do with your website. Like none of that, like thinking about things linearly, and SEOs have such a problem with this. Doesn't make sense. Okay, content cluster, bunch of topics, bunch of questions. I'll answer the most popular. Like that's not an actual cluster of helpful information. What Mum does is say, okay, great, you have a ton of content about it. You've answered all of the questions that SEMrush told you to answer. You get a check mark. However, we're really looking for this kind of information. You don't have any of that. And the only way to know this is not using an SEO tool. The only way to actually understand what kind of information you should be answering is by thinking about the same thing Google's trying to do. What's Google trying to do? They're trying to predict your needs. So you're a searcher. I type in, go to Yankees game, and Google's trying to predict what it is I might need to know. Google's trying to do that now, but they're limited by their technology. Once Google gets the boost from Mum, Google will be able to expand on that. So they're going to be able to actually predict in a far better way all the various things I might need to know. No SEO tool is going to be able to tell you that because they're all scraping after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So that really is the kind of $1 million question in all of this, because it's like if we're going to talk about how SEOs are able to kind of prepare or how they should be approaching their content. So it's like a two-part question, and one of them you've pretty much answered already. So the first question really on the whole is how should they prepare in terms of actually structuring content and thinking about it? Should it be maybe going within your team? Like say, for example, you're trying to sell a product, go to your sales team, figuring out what exactly is that kind of process or journey and the common kind of things that people might have in terms of their experience in the user journey or the buyer journey, and then be able to sort of match that and provide answers for it. But the second part of it is also, it's like, well, can we do this with SEO tools? And if the answer is no at the moment, what can SEO tools do to develop into the future to be able to kind of address this concept? And can they?
That's a good question. I'm not going to answer it first. Sorry. You brought up a good point about talking about intent. And I feel like the whole intent equation has gotten SEOs to start thinking about things as real marketers, like things that are really simple for actual marketers. Not to say that search marketers are not actual marketers, but I mean, traditional marketers. That's a better word. We are like, wow, this is so new. Like, oh, thinking about the user, huh? Like people are like, yeah, dude, I've been thinking about this in 1960. But as SEOs, like, yeah, this is novel. Things like Mum are going to force us to start doing that way more than we already are. And intent has already started that ball rolling, right? Now you hear things around like keyword research as being topical versus like, all right, search volume. So the ball's gotten rolling. Mum is going to take it to a much greater extent. I don't think the fundamental problem with tools, and this is Google's fundamental problem, except like they have a massive amount of, AI and machine learning and money, and SEO tools don't compare to Google, is that what you're trying to do with SaaS technology, if you're Google, whatever the heck they're doing, is you're trying to understand qualitative behavior or predict qualitative thought patterns in this case, right? You're trying to predict what people want by using quantities, right? So let's take, things like RankBrain, right? RankBrain sees, you know what? Like, we show these results. Out of all of the results, the people are only staying on the page when there's an image on the page. Let's say it's a recipe website. Like when RankBrain came out, like very soon afterwards, every single recipe website page, whatever it was for your whatever query, had to have an image. Like now you probably have to have a video also, because it realized like you show up to a recipe site or page and there's no image, that you bounce. So it's trying to predict like what it's taking prediction based on numerical values. Like this happens so often, it must be the truth. But there's always going to be a schism and a gap there. So the first question is, if the tools are always going to have a schism, when the tools come into effect is when you're trying to work at bulk and you're trying to work at scale, where you can't do this, like I can't just sit back and think about it, it's too much. So you need a tool. If you could just sit back and think about it and figure it out and then correlate it with some data after the fact, isn't that much better? So to answer your question, you're trying to think about like my target audience, right? My whole website is about going to Yankees games, let's just say. And you're trying to fundamentally understand your audience. Like I would just understand your audience first and then go to a tool secondly. So I think like the question is almost like a misnomer. Like how do I use it? You don't. I'll tell you, like, so I forgot what it was. I was like doing a study on what the availability of like non-super authority websites are for health queries. And I was trying to find actual queries to use in my study outside of, going to the tools. I had two sets of queries, like these short tail kind of queries. I went to an SEO tool. I pulled out 1,000 queries and I ran them and analyzed them. But then when you start looking at like more long tail queries or more, detailed queries about health topics, it gets a little harder. So I'm just ask my family. They're all sick with all their, ailments. So my sister was pregnant at the time. I remember going to an SEO tool, pulling a bunch of long tail keywords around pregnancy, and then asking her, like, what are your questions about being pregnant? And then none of them were the same. Or I went into the health forums and look at the questions people were asking there versus what the tools were showing me. And they're totally different. So if you really want to understand your audience, because what you're trying to do, again, is predictive need, which marketers have been doing forever, but now we're going to have to be doing it. The only way to really do or really to predict the needs of your audience is to understand them. The only way to do that is empathy, to really understand where they're coming from, what problems are they facing, what problems might they face. Almost like a teacher, I'm saying as like experience. And when I used to lesson plan as a teacher, so you would do is you come up with a plan. Here's what I'm going to teach today. And then you try to sit back and think, who's in my class? Okay, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so are going to be sitting in the front row. Got them. This is fine for them. All right. But, so-and-so and so-and-so are slacking off in the back row. This is not fine for them. Like they're going to need something else in order to understand this. What are they going to need in order to understand what I'm going to be talking about for the next hour? That's the only way to really understand your audience is to do that. And you can use tools where you get stuck. You want to, okay, I have a general understanding. I want to maybe more refine it. What are people looking for? That could be very helpful, right? If you want to see, and I look at these things thematically when it comes to the tools, and I think this will be more appropriate going forward when, mum comes into full effect or things, continue to develop as they are, even without mum. I like to look at whatever the keywords I'm getting back from whatever tool are thematically, right? So if I see, let's say, I type in a keyword, I get back 100 questions in whatever SEO keyword research tool that I'm using. Are there any patterns in there? Are there any questions like, do any questions show some kind of confusion around the product that I'm offering? Okay, like that tells you, like, forget the particular questions and what they're particularly confused about, but there seems to be a general confusion about this product. Then I need to know that as a marketer or somebody running content or as an SEO walking into the game. So the particular questions or the particular keywords suggestions you get back can be helpful, but they're more helpful when you analyze them thematically. So you can say, like, here's an area I haven't investigated. Or here's a whole subtopic. The keyword research tools come back and they give you a subtopic that you never thought it was even applicable. And this is, by the way, how I use search volume. Like if I see it's very appropriate for you, podcasting. So I podcast too. So I was looking up podcasting in SEMrush. All of the, if you look at like of all the things you need as a podcaster, all the tools that you need, there's a million times more search volume around USB mics than anything else. Like all other equipment is not equal in search volume to USB mics. Everybody's interested in what? Mics. That tells you something right there, right? That's the most, and you can dive into that. Like, what's more important to my audience? Cheap mics or best mics? Well, best mics has a higher search volume. I'm oversimplifying this, but like, okay, so I'll go with best mics. That's more relevant to my audience. Forget the search volume for a minute. Going through it like that and trying to pick apart what the tools are offering so you can find those blind spots that you've missed when you sat back and empathized and thought about your audience, like the way you would as school kids in a classroom. That's where I think the tools come in. Now, how can they? Sorry to overstep again. Now, to answer your how could I have no idea how they're able to bridge that gap, right? They're all using machine learning, as they all claim to be using machine learning. They're going to have to up their game somehow. I am not a developer of machine learning technology, but that's probably how they're going to have to do it.
Mm-hmm. So you've covered a lot of things there in those answers, and I'm trying to think of how in terms of simplifying it for an SEO that's going to try and think about this. So am I right in suggesting that if you are looking to think about a content strategy using the kind of what the possible implications of mum will be in the future, it's more of actually maybe performing keyword research, but you have to at the same time be actively talking with your audience to actually know what it is that they want and what their experiences are. And the reason I say that is because I feel like some people think at the moment, in terms of traditional ways of combating this, is like they'll say, okay, yeah, obviously you've got to focus on the user, but when they say that, they're essentially going to keyword research tools and then thinking that that is the user, like the result set is the user, instead of actually talking to your audience, like actually you directly talking to them.
Yes. I mean, so 2 points to that. One is, again, as my first, or I mentioned earlier, that's cyclical. That's sort of like going, it's literally like going to the SERP, because again, the SEO tools are pulling data by scraping the SERP, right? It's like going to the SERP and saying, well, Google's ranking this first, this second, this third. I'll just recreate the same thing, but a little bit better. Copycat content, right? The problem with that is like Google's like, yeah, great. But if we had that, or I'm sorry, if we had something completely different, we would totally rank that number one way above and beyond everything. So, but we don't have that because everybody's creating the same crap because everybody's doing the same thing. The only way to create something different is to do what you mentioned, to actually understand your audience, understand what's needed, understand whatever, and then create that content and be willing to take that risk. But to speak to the idea of talking to your audience, stop thinking about it as SEO for like 3 seconds. And in general, I recommend stop thinking about it as SEO for 3 seconds. Imagine this is your business. You would just go to a tool, whatever tool, to tell you the answers. Anyone who's ever actually done anything and then asked their target audience, they're like market research, will tell you the insights I got from doing 100 interviews versus the insights I got by using whatever tool. The insights I got from talking to 100 people were a million times better. The fact that we don't do that naturally as SEOs tells you there's something broken in the process.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think maybe it's just the thinking about it, of it being SEO. When you think SEO, what do you think of? You think Google, and I think maybe that mindset has to change a bit, where it's
that's the whole thing, right?
Because if we're going from thinking of just the search engines and what they want to thinking about the users and what they want, it's not enough just to go to and do some keyword research, because that's still based off scrapes and based off data being pulled from search engines. So it's like, if we really want to talk about users, and I think this is where we'll kind of get to the end point here, is like you have to go to the users directly and not be using mediums like basically things being scraped off the SERPs as a way to substitute that. Like there is no substitute for that. And I think data you get, and when you talk to people conducting primary market research with your audience, I think that's the best way to be able to plan any sort of content strategy if we're taking into account mum and its implications for SEO in the future.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think what you're saying is a million percent true. And I like the way you put it with content strategy, because SEO content and actual content strategy, they've been merging very closely over the last 4 or 5 years. They're going to merge far closer than they ever have before because of things like mum. Because look, the whole idea of mum or things like mum is that Google's trying to think more and more like a human would think, as close as it possibly can. So what happens in return, although there's an enormous lag, is that SEOs start thinking more like the search engine, which is thinking more like a person. So you're accidentally trying to think more like a person as an SEO because you're trying to write for Google. The best thing to do is, Wayne Gretzky, skate towards the puck. Like, forget Google for a second. Just skip the middleman. If Google's trying to understand people, so then you should understand people. It's like future-proofing your content. You'll be ahead of the curve kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what people should start doing right now, pretty much, if they really want to get ahead with this.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about how do I, future-proof against core updates. Like, that's how you future-proof against core updates.
Yeah,
because that's what Google's trying to do. Obviously, not in every case. Like, you're just like, if you're writing about, 8-track, cassette tapes, like, you're just not relevant anymore, no matter how much you're thinking about the 5 people who still use those things.
Yeah, and I think that this is it. I think it's about, we need to now be more proactive as an industry in terms of getting the right types of information to make better content, which Google will reward, and then everyone's happy. I think if we take that approach, then everyone's happy. But, we'll see how that pans out. It is, of course, very interesting to see.
Everybody's happy, but the technical SEOs, they're not happy.
Well, yeah, I mean, oh well, we'll see. We'll see what that impact will be as well. But it's of course very interesting, and a very interesting topic indeed. And I think we can wrap this one up. So Mordy, thank you so much for joining me today on the SEO Unplugged podcast. Where can people find you if they want to hear more about your rambling?
I'm very active on TikTok.
Oh yeah,
very active. I dance. I fall downstairs. I sing.
Cool.
I don't have an account yet, but if I did, that's what I would be doing. But you can generally find me on Twitter at Mordy Oberstein.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Twitter's the way to go for now, but I guess you'll keep us posted when you move over to
when they start accepting boomers on the TikTok, then I'll go on.
Fantastic.
And I'll do boomer stuff.
I'll join you in on that.
All right, great.
Mordy, thank you so much for being here today, and thanks to all the listeners as well. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, you've reached the end of this video, but don't worry, there's plenty more great content that you can watch right now. All you have to do is click one of the 2 video links on the left side of the screen. And also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to never miss out on future uploads.